I don't think there's a date to the birth of that.
The concern for the environment starts when I was born, in fact.
Mainly it has come through my daughter Gloria.
It has to do a lot with the uprising that my mother did to my sister and I.
Has inherited from her mother.
I've always lived with that concern and with that sensitivity towards the ocean, towards the environment.
We were very close every time to nature. We had all kinds of animals always running around in the house. From my mother's side, the family, they're all scientists, ornithologists, biologists, zoologists. It started with a trip that I did on my own and visited a couple of countries that I did not know with very foreign languages, and I was premeditating a little bit how to conceptualize the movement. And when I came back, that was 2 years ago, the movement of a wave of change was born.
It's not a project, it's a movement.
First thing I did was ask my father and my sister what they thought about it.
It is a real problem for the humanity.
I remember that meeting perfectly well. I was with my sister in this office.
They completely were aligned and they clicked.
To the point that it's becoming a key aspect of our brand identity. The ocean.
Oof.
What an interesting question.
The ocean for me is literally everything.
To the sea, I would say, don't get worst.
And to still have trust in us.
And we have to take it.
So be patient, because we're gonna give you your space and we're gonna be allowing you to recover your health.
The sea means freedom for me.
The corals are only 1% of the seafloor bed, but at the end they host 25% of marine life. That is fascinating.
Getting to explore with Gloria what the potential of wave of change is.
To give solutions to the scientific world.
The issues and the areas of potential solutions in every various different location.
How can we give back to the coral restoration community? All that for me would be utopia again as well.
This mentality of responsibility, of looking inwards, of changing their own habits, changing their family's habit.
Estamos haciendo algo que es muy importante.
Cuando decimos, vamos a ver si podemos ir más allá de plásticos en todo el social.
What were the first personal changes?
Y es que la organización se implica.
This is something that you have to make on your own and you have to empower yourselves to do it, right?
Tenemos que trabajar porque obviamente hay que hacer un cambio en la sociedad.
Consumo responsable, no solamente en pesca, ¿no? En todo.
Pues me entusiasma que hagamos aquí pruebas piloto y que seamos nosotros también pioneros.
Y la ola de cambio es adrenalina.
14 rooms, but not with our sizes, right?
And so with this commitment from the family in a way that just kind of overwhelms you with a genuine sense of purpose and drive, we saw it very important to come up with some clear, ambitious, and quantitative targets to be able to be scientifically driven to real world problems for how we could actually help to protect oceans and make this a major part of our purpose. So we've been calling these our 5 long-term commitments to 2030. And they are as follows: that Iberostar's operations are free of single-use plastic in all of our operations by 2020, waste-free as in sending nothing to landfill by 2025, and carbon neutral by 2030, using nature in our destinations as a primary way to offset any of our remaining carbon footprint that we would have in 2030. Our second goal is to have 100% responsible consumption of our seafood, not only looking at sourcing imported goods that are certified or rated as sustainable, but also lifting up local fisheries and the destinations where we're operating in ways that are in line with the sustainability community. The third objective is that all of our ecosystems that surround, all of the nature that surrounds our properties are in improving ecological health alongside profitable tourism by 2030. The fourth is that Wave of Change is recognized by our clients in state, 90% of them by 2023, is a major driver for 60% of clients to choose Iberostar by 2025. And the fifth is about leading responsible tourism, where our actions are adopted by 2 times the number of hotels that Iberostar owns or manages by 2030. So that we have practices, roadmaps, commitments that can be followed by others. And I'm sure this is an area that we would love to talk more in our conversation and at this conference generally, on ways that others can kind of use roadmaps or playbooks to adopt some of these practices across the sector broadly. So that's a little bit of an introduction to what we are working on with our Wave of Change movement at Iberostar. And I'm going to go ahead and stop presenting so that we can chat.
Excellent, thank you. I've seen the video before, but I think I enjoyed it even more the second time around. So inspirational. So thank you to the family and to Iberostar for taking this on. It's a big commitment, it really is. I guess my first question for you, I'm going to kind of start right at the beginning. Going plastic free is certainly one thing. Going waste free in 5 years. So what's your sort of, can you explain to me a little bit of your plan on sort of how you make that happen?
Absolutely. It was a really big ambition, one that was not possible without first seeing that we could do that in a hotel in Europe. And so actually our Iberostar Cristina in Mallorca is waste free by working in a really great partnership with a local waste management in the municipality Tirme, who works on helping us with composting, managing food waste, managing any of the hazardous and dangerous residuals that we might be generating on property. But unfortunately, we don't have waste management collaborators like Tirme in all of our destinations. And you bring up a really great point, Natalie, which is how is it that we plan to get there? And this is something that we have found to be one of the most important components, is having milestones that are annual, that allow us to achieve these big comprehensive goals, but then most importantly, presenting those milestones to the world so that we can be held accountable for it, but that it can also serve as inspiration for others on those roadmaps. So for example, the roadmap for how we plan to achieve 100% responsible seafood is available on our Wave of Change website. And our circular economy roadmap, which will include not only how we have planned to achieve waste-free, but also carbon neutrality, will be launching on our website in December. And our roadmap to achieving coastal health will be launching as well at the beginning of the year, alongside work that we're doing with the high-level panel for sustainable ocean economy on a tourism-wide roadmap for nature-based solutions. So for waste, this first started with recognizing that every hotel manages their residuals in some way or capacity, right? There's bins, there's processes, there's ways to get waste off of the facilities themselves. And the first important part is to recognize that a lot of times they're not organized into a single department. There's some that are working in kitchens, some in housekeeping, et cetera. So our first step was to create an entire department dedicated to the management of these products. And we're actually in the early stages now of renaming this department so that they're not actually the waste management department, but the Department of Reuse. Because if in a circular economy, waste is really not existing as a concept, then you need to be looking at the packaging that's coming from these products and saying, wait, but I can't recycle this. What am I supposed to be doing with this? And reporting those problems to government. So the first was creating a department, and we're in the process of that now. The second is measurement, because we know through our certifications like EarthCheck, which is a really great way to get a baseline of how you are performing, how much waste we are generating kind of generally. That goes to recycling, that goes to a landfill, but we need more resolution in that sort of information. So we find that a large portion of the residuals comes from our gardens and our kitchens. And so measuring that organic waste in a quantified fashion really helps us to know how to optimize even further any of the waste that we're generating. This is actually incredibly relevant even now for tourism, as they're facing one of the most economically challenging events in its history as an industry, because removing waste is directly related to efficiency. So this is an area where we can use both of those targets to align together and say, what are the targets for reduction in food waste? And then by category, we can move to have those waste categories get reduced and more controlled in the process. A third step in that way is to realize that some of that waste is generated before it ever enters into the property. Pallet wraps, packaging, all of this information that needs to happen as innovation in the supply chain. So it's also working very deeply with our suppliers to see if they can help us find, source, or create new products. When we went to have dispensers that were multi-use in our rooms to be free of single-use amenities, we asked our providers if they could have an organic, higher quality cosmetic, to have dispensers that were not made of virgin materials, but actually recycled plastic, and to see if they could actually refill those dispensers as part of that process. So innovating past the supply chain was another really important component. And then finally, it's recognizing that you will have to manage some of those residuals because you do produce residuals in these sorts of operations. So we have a pilot project working on industrial scale composting in some of our complexes in the Dominican Republic, working with external groups that help us to manage the recyclables, to manage any of the more dangerous chemicals or the technology waste that we're generating in our operations, and seeing how we can be as much efficient as efficient as possible in that circular economy.
Excellent, excellent. You said a couple of things that I'd like you to explain for our audience, just so that they get a sense of the breadth and depth of some of these things, and primarily around the circular economy. So could you maybe explain for people what the circular economy is?
Absolutely. This is a concept that is, it's kind of funny because once you start thinking about it, everything that you do in your daily life, or at least it was the case for me, starts to shift. You see it in a little bit of a different line. So a circular economy, first, let me explain what a linear economy is. It's the way in which we extract resources. We extract timber to make paper or paper products. We extract minerals to make technological devices. We use them in our daily lives, many times just one time. And then that product goes to waste. It goes to a landfill. Sometimes it's incinerated, and very little of it is actually recycled in back into that economy. An economy where we do a lot of recycling says, yes, we're still generating a lot of waste, but we're going to be recycling as much as possible. We want higher quality plastics. We want higher quality waste streams so that we can increase the amount of products that we're putting back into the system. A circular economy actually says waste does not exist as a concept. It's about turning waste into a new product and saying, how can we actually re-extract those materials and use them over and over again? So for us, it means the efficiency, the sourcing, and the end life of the water, energy, and products that we use in our built environment, the hotels. And so that's what a circular economy means for us.
Excellent. So a circular economy mimics a natural process, which would be circular by nature, right?
Yeah, I think the easiest way we can think about this is, waste is food. Okay, great. So when you compost your apple core, it rots, it turns into soil thanks to worms and microorganisms, and that soil then becomes nutrient and fertilizer for a new set of apples, right? But how do you actually think about that for your computer? Or how do you think about that for furniture or the construction and the built environment that you have around you? So you really have to question a lot of the products and the processes that you have. But that's exactly it. In the biological cycles, it's really clear. It's restoring these natural processes. When you get into kind of the more technical side of the materials and the metals and the electronics, it becomes a little bit more complicated, but a lot of the same philosophies apply.
Right. On to the next question, which I'm very curious about from a personal perspective. You're going to take all of your seafood sustainable. Now, when you say seafood, is that simply what we think of as seafood, or is it seafood as well as fish? Maybe explain, the definition, and then I'd love to know how you guys are going to do that.
Absolutely. One of our first steps was actually to define what responsible was, which was, actually not an incredibly easy task. We had a really great set of conversations with some colleagues from the Marine Stewardship Council and GSSI and fair trade groups that are working on sustainability. And, it's a little bit of a moving target. But what is most important is to realize that seafood, so the shellfish, the fish, the farm raised or the wild caught, anything that comes from the ocean or came from the ocean at some point, we're counting in this sort of category. So from your lobster to your salmon, to your tuna, to your grouper, all of that kind of counts. All of that counts as seafood. In many cases, seafood is the last product that humanity harvests from the wild. Right? We farm a lot of our almost entirely all of our agriculture and produce is farmed. And while aquaculture, the farming version of seafood, is growing and is going to be a really important way that we feed the next billion, that we reduce our total global footprint in climate change, we still have a lot of wild caught fish. 30 years ago, humanity thought that the ocean was a limitless resource. We now very much know that's not the case. Over 3/4 of all fisheries, wild caught seafood, are either fully exploited or overexploited, meaning that if we take any more than we're currently taking, those fisheries could actually collapse and we won't have bluefin tuna for next generations to come. Bluefin tuna is actually an endangered species. And so that by definition means its populations have reduced substantially. So that's kind of why it's a problem and why we decided to focus on this topic. For us, responsible seafood means 3 categories. The first is that it is certified, but not just any certification, certified by a certification benchmarked by GSSI, on the Global Sustainability Seafood Initiative. And that includes things like the Marine Stewardship Council, Aquaculture Stewardship Council, Global Gap, and we definitely encourage you to check out their website to see some of the labels that they have benchmarked across all of the industry to really be sustainable. Those are the kind of most rigorous categories, but they don't represent all of the global seafood supply. The second is seafood that is rated by the Monterey Bay Aquarium Seafood Watch as green or yellow. Fortunately, in Canadian and American markets, this is something that does work when we're in the supermarket. You can see a lot of these green or yellow ratings for seafood, or what we call fishery improvement projects or aquaculture improvement projects. They're also included in that second category. We also encourage you to look up what that means and what fisheries are working on these improvements. And the third category was born because we realized that those first 2 definitions meant that almost in none of our locations could we also source local seafood, because a lot of that comes from more developed fisheries like in Norway or in other locations where we weren't able to source locally and sustainably. So this third category is still in a framework development. We're talking a lot with the seafood community to see what this could look like, but it's not in a certification, not in an improvement project yet, but locally sourced. And how can we lift up local fisheries to also include them as an important part of these destinations? So for example, right now we're looking at lobster in Jamaica. And in fact, next week, we'll be deploying surveys to the fishing community, asking about what some of their needs are, what some of their barriers are, and seeing whether or not we can help to bring this lobster fishery towards an improvement project and continue to actually source that lobster by 2025, because per our definition for 100% responsible sourcing, it either needs to be in one of those 3 categories for it to count.
Right. Wow. It looks like this is such a complex, and sustainability is such a complex thing, right? And we're just, we're just simple meeting and event planners. So when we embark on taking our events and making them more sustainable, understanding that choosing a sustainable venue is a great place to start. What are some of the things that you feel, now you've come from the sciences and you've entered into this industry, you're starting to see us as a profession. What are some of your suggestions for how we can take steps to be more sustainable in our planning and the execution of our events?
Yeah, absolutely. I think being at conferences like these and asking questions and learning more is one of the first steps that you can take. But I think in terms of how this can apply to events, a lot of the same advice that we might give to an individual, can also apply to event planning and then be scaled so that the impact that you make in one event is equal to the impact that you make maybe as an individual and in your entire year, right? So some easy tips and tricks that we have are to monitor your waste, right? At an event, maybe you can look and see what is produced at the end of that event and how could that be avoided in the future? Was it a lot of packaging from the food service that you had? Is that a question or conversation that you can have with the food service provider? Was there a lot of food waste because some of the items maybe weren't being consumed as much, or the timing of those? So monitoring your waste is one really great way to be able to enter into that category. The third is to ask the location where the event is being held, hey, what are your sustainability policies? How do you make your events more sustainable? That helps in two ways. Not only does it allow you to have more information about whether or not those policies even exist in the first place, and then you can learn a little bit about, we are working on removing single-use plastics, or we're working on having responsible seafood options, but it also signals to the locations that this is important to you, and that's important for them to be able to get your business in the future. And this, I guarantee you, is the tipping point of how this becomes industry-wide, when clients and when event planners are asking for sustainability to be on their top 5 lists of reasons why they would choose a destination over another. So those are kind of two really big ways that one could bring some of these practices into your professions.
So now I'm going to ask you a little bit more serious question about, things don't look good right now. So, what's at stake if we don't embrace these programs and make them work?
I think we actually need only look to news today to see what is at stake. And this is not only in some of the more present topics, like unhealthy relationships between humans and nature are a major source of many infectious diseases that can become widespread. And this is actually a really major reason why good management and protection of nature needs to be a part of our planning. But also, if you're in California right now, or in Australia at the beginning of the years, the wildfires have set records. I'm from California, and seeing my state burn was incredibly heartbreaking to realize the amount of impact that climate change is having already in many of the locations that are around the world. I now live in Miami. We've had one of the wettest, hottest. We even went through the entire alphabet for naming the number of hurricanes that have come through the Atlantic region. And they had to enter into the Greek alphabet because they didn't have enough names for the number of hurricanes. Those hurricanes are slower and wetter, and that becomes a really major risk for these destinations. But honestly and unfortunately, what is most at stake are small developing island nations and developing areas. And so this is also a very disproportionate problem that affects many of the destinations that tourism depends on, which is why we really believe that tourism plays a major role in valuing that nature alive. But I also think that because there's so much at stake, it can often feel so overwhelming to be able to take any steps moving forward. And as someone trained in the sciences, in learning what these major problems were for the oceans for 10 years, a decade of learning the problems, the first time that I felt most hopeful was when the private sector became involved in a very serious way, saying, look, let's ask questions straight, let's learn and be informed by the science, but most importantly, let's see how our resources and our specific skills and contributions can add to those solutions. We just had a really great article that came out in Euronews that was talking about a coral lab that we built inside of our hotel in the Dominican Republic. And I was talking about in that article, this coral lab became a Noah's Ark that we didn't know we needed to build until all of a sudden we need it. What does that mean? Coral are incredibly important for protecting our coastlines, providing home to fish populations that are a primary source of protein for millions of people around the world. And in the Caribbean, coral not only face climate change and bleaching and warmer waters as an issue, but there's also a really big disease, a pandemic that is occurring in coral reefs in the Caribbean called the stony coral rapid tissue loss disease. Scientists really need to name their diseases a little more charismatically, or maybe not charismatically. But all of a sudden, this disease was concentrated in Florida for 4 years, and then it popped up all across the Caribbean in just under a year. And we were in the midst of building this coral lab facility that we were going to use as an outreach center and as a place to house the coral that we were using in our reef restoration efforts. This, in the middle of our planning, the disease arrived in the northern part of the Dominican Republic. And it was like, all of a sudden, it became one of the most important genetic things. It was the only facility in the entire country that was protected actually from this waterborne disease, because we had a system that was outside of the circuit of pulling water from the ocean. And this disease was spreading, and we were rushing to build this facility. If I was an academic, I would have spent 2 years hiring a team, 3 years looking for grants, another 2 years after that, finding the expertise to build a facility in a country where I don't have operational presence. Iberostar did this in less than a year, right? In less than a year, with the construction teams that were available, the directors that managed the operations, the clients that were there rooting us on throughout the process. So it really can provide these interesting new solutions that can accelerate to scale to the level of the problems that we're facing.
As sort of my final question to you is that sometimes we do find this really overwhelming, and sometimes when the problem's really overwhelming, you have to take tiny baby steps. And so one of the things that we always ask everyone that we interact with is, what is your favorite climate action, or the thing that you do that's a little bit different or unusual that you would recommend that our people do? Understanding that I agree completely with you, individual actions can be scaled for group events, but it often starts with individual action. What would be your thing?
And two are competing as top of the mind, so maybe I'll go with those two. And they're really easy for us to apply in our daily lives, right? And the first is literally just monitoring your waste production and asking, how can I reduce this, right? If you look at your waste and you say, I generate 3 bags of trash a week, I wonder how I can get that down to 2. You look and you see, it's because I'm using a lot of plastic bags. There's no solution that works for all of us. So the best way to know what works for you is to look at your own habits and behaviors, right? And ask some of those questions on how you can reduce accordingly. For me, it was thinking differently about how I purchased my food, because I found 80% of my own trash was filled with food packaging, right? So instead of getting the tomatoes in a plastic bag in a cardboard container, I got the tomatoes that were on the vine. It's not a big difference at the grocery store, a huge difference on my waste. The second is, and this one can be a little bit controversial and compelling, is not to be exclusively vegan or vegetarian. If you are, I think that that's a really great way to make a contribution, but to just eat less red meat. And I know that that sounds kind of weird, but if we actually think about it, we have a carbon footprint. We are using resources. That's okay. We get to use resources. It's about how we use those resources in balance. And what we find is that as individuals, we talk about flights, we talk about cars, but actually the red meat that we consume can sometimes be some of the biggest carbon footprint in our own personal budgets. This is not about saying never eat a burger again. This is about saying eat 3 less than you might have otherwise, right? Because there's actually a really great study that came out in Science, one of our most important magazines or literature, peer-reviewed publications in the scientific literature, that said, if you actually look at the carbon footprint of products, shipping and where it came from is a tiny percentage of its carbon footprint, but how it was produced, the amount of forest that needed to be cleared for the cattle to graze, the amount of energy that was put into producing the food for the livestock, the methane that is produced by cows as they go about their daily lives, and just the amount of energy that goes into the production of red meat is very energetically costly. And if you can just reduce the amount of red meat that you're eating by a little bit, and surprisingly, this also applies to things like cheese, right? In fact, the carbon footprint of cheese is sometimes higher than the carbon footprint of seafood, even though that is kind of a primary protein, because of the way that this works. And so that's another kind of tip that I would give, is to try and eat just a little bit less red meat.
Excellent. Well, thank you. Megan, thank you so much. I learned so much every time I talk to you, or even better yet, it makes things that I've wondered about sort of more clear. And, sustainability is a journey. I appreciate you having patience with those of us who are far behind you on the journey. So, but thank you for sharing your expertise and your patience and your goodwill and your optimism.
No, absolutely. And I think that's the final message is, every single day, sometimes it feels like there's so many decisions that we can optimize and make, and then it becomes overwhelming. But if you just start with one area and just turn it into habit, and it becomes free, bringing your reusable water bottle or buying the tomatoes that aren't in the packaging or something like that, it actually really, really does add up, and allow for this sort of change at large. So every single step is definitely really important. And thank you for the opportunity to talk about our Wave of Change movement and some of the things we're doing at Iberostar.
Well, it's Thanksgiving weekend, so we're recording this on the Friday before Thanksgiving weekend. I'm about to go grocery shopping, so I will buy the mushrooms and the tomatoes and the things that I can loose rather. So thank you. I thought that was a really, really helpful tip. And thank you once again, and can't wait to see you. You will be live on the panel on October 22nd, and we get to ask you all kinds of questions. So thank you.